The eyes of the world are on the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza as a result of Israel's attacks on the enclave. But there's another crisis taking place, one the UN has described as, quote, a humanitarian travesty. It isn't getting much attention at all. This is Idem Wassornu, Director of Operations at the UN Office for the Coordination for Humanitarian Affairs.
Sudan is on the course to become the world's possibly worst hunger crisis. Already 18 million people, again, has been said. More than 1/3 of the country's estimated population are facing food insecurity. By the time the lean season arrives in May, people in some parts of Darfur could face what we term IPC Phase 5 level acute food insecurity. We call this stage a catastrophe.
Wassornu added that an estimated 222,000 children in Sudan could die from malnutrition, and that the WHO report that 70% of health facilities are currently not functioning. Now, this catastrophic situation in Sudan stems from the civil war, which erupted there last April when two powerful generals began a struggle for control of the country. The first of those is Abdel Fattah al-Burhan. He's the head of the Sudanese army. He became Sudan's de facto president in 2019 after ousting the previous president in a coup. The other figure is Mohamed Hamdan Dagalo, who was Burhan's second in command and also participated in the 2019 coup. Dagalo is more commonly known by the nickname Hemeti. He is the head of the Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. They're a largely Arab paramilitary force which grew out of the Janjaweed. Now, the Janjaweed were a militant group responsible for the killing of hundreds of thousands of black Africans in Darfur between 2003 and 2020. At the time, that violence was called the first genocide of the 21st century. And now Burhan's and Hemeti's struggle for power over the last 10 months has killed at least 15,000, left 33,000 injured, and displaced 10 million people within Sudan. The fighting between these competing military groupings initially focused on the capital Khartoum, but it has now spread throughout the country. However, the most extreme violence appears to be taking place once again in Darfur. Located in the country's west, Darfur is a mineral-rich region, roughly the same size as Spain. Home to around 80 ethnic groups, it has a population of over 9 million people. Growing violence in the region has now resulted in the displacement of 3 million Darfuris, a third of the population, with many gathering in makeshift camps on the country's border with Chad. And the political vacuum in Khartoum has meant that what little aid there is not being distributed. According to Médecins Sans Frontières, in just one camp in northern Darfur, 13 children are dying every day of malnutrition and unsafe drinking water. 700,000 people have also crossed the border into Chad, living in temporary camps near the Sudanese border. That has created its own problems. Chad is one of the world's poorest countries, and the Norwegian Refugee Council says that those taking refuge there lack the most basic resources for survival. To cope with the crisis in Chad, the UN's refugee agency says it needs $320 million this year. So far, it's received only $12 million. That's just 4% of the total. For those remaining in Sudan, the violence continues to be brutal, with aid agencies sounding the alarm over the possibility of a second genocide in Darfur. The UN Joint Human Rights Office has recently received, quote, credible reports of 13 mass graves in western Darfur, and the agency has accused both the RSF and the Sudanese army of sexual violence and harassment of women. The BBC reported this testimony from one of those women.
Yesterday, 19-year-old Amina found out that she is pregnant. Within minutes, she will begin an abortion, desperately hoping that her family never knows.
It happened in Sudan. I'm not married and I was a virgin, except for the incident that happened.
This young woman, whose name we have changed, was trying to flee fighting in her hometown when she was captured, held for a day, and repeatedly raped.
I didn't tell anyone, and I don't think anyone knows.
The UN says the sexual violence experienced by women like Amina is a defining characteristic of the conflict in Sudan and has been used as a weapon of war.
In December, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that the RSF were responsible for crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing in Darfur, and he accused both the RSF and the Sudanese army of committing war crimes. In January, ICC prosecutor Karim Khan said that both the RSF and the Sudanese authorities were blocking his ability to investigate potentially criminal abuses in Darfur. Earlier today, I spoke to Joshua Craze, a researcher and writer specializing in the politics of Sudan. I began by asking him whether the civil war in Sudan had become an ethnic conflict.
Whether it's become an ethnic conflict is a difficult question, because the conflict in Sudan is a patchwork of different dynamics. So the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces under Hemeti, have been mobilizing in Darfur since 2022 on the basis of a certain form of Arab nationalism that really has its roots in a conference that Gaddafi held way back in the 80s in Libya. And the war has been a chance, especially in West Darfur, for many of those Arab groups to pursue what are effectively local ethnicized conflicts that have been supercharged effectively by the national conflict. So that is an example of a clearly ethnic relationship within the war. There's another example of that in South Kordofan, which is in the south of Sudan, not South Sudan, but the south of Sudan. And there, a lot of the Arab groups have joined the RSF, partly to wage a war against the Nuba. And the Nuba, again, are a non-Arab population that form part of one of the rebel groups that fought against Khartoum for 22 years during Sudan's long second civil war. So around the country, if I want to say in brief, there's been this way that the overall logic of the civil war has been taken up to fight local conflicts. And those groups have been armed, in the case of the Arab groups, by the RSF. And you've also had anti-Darfuri Arab attacks in places like Port Sudan, which is now the de facto capital of the country, owned or controlled by SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces. But I wouldn't say that the actual logic of the conflict is ethnic.
Once order breaks down, once you've got a generalized war, then you will get these sort of ethnic conflicts coming up, of course, sort of in Darfur, where the most attention is focused internationally at the moment. I suppose, I mean, I've been sort of following this to some degree for a year now, and it's still, it's not completely clear in my mind what the two different sides are standing for. So you've got the RSF, which is this militia, and then you've got the SAF, which is the official armed forces. This has now descended into a complete civil war. Is this just a sort of battle now between warlords for control, or is there something deeper going on here?
I think there's something much deeper going on here, which I think is the breakdown of the political economic relationship that formed the Sudanese state. And let me state that really simply. If Sudan, since independence 56, has been about a racist center, extracting resources from the peripheries of the country with their myriad ethnic groups, relying on them for surplus labor, while maintaining all the political power in the center, I think that relationship itself is unthinkable after this war. Because whatever one says about Hemeti and the RSF, they are a force from the periphery that are now contesting a war in the center of the country. Why are they contesting the war? Well, I think if you take the RSF, it's three different things at once. It's like an incredible Schrodinger's cat. And the fact that it's these three different things at once prevents it being any of them well, except that you need to be all these three different things in order to survive. So what are those three things? One, in Darfur, it is an ethnically organized Arab militia. It's drawing in Arab fighters from Chad. It's waging war against non-Arab groups who are often agriculturalists, waging a transhuman or a pastoralist agenda and trying to gain control of Darfur. Very much a local ethnic conflict, prefigured by climatic change in Chad and Darfur. Two, though, is also a transnational corporation which has sent mercenaries to Libya, to Yemen, which is basically doing the bidding of the United Arab Emirates. At a regional level, it's trying to guarantee them access to the Red Sea. It's trying to guarantee them agricultural land. The Emirates has bought off Chad, so it will support the RSF. It's about to buy off South Sudan, so it will support the RSF. At the same time, Hemeti is also trying to position himself as a statesman who will bring forth a sort of a new civilian government, of course, with this infrastructure, which is RSF-controlled military. So he's trying to do three things, and they're all undercutting each other. So he keeps on getting involved in massacres in Darfur, which don't make him look like a statesman.
One thing you hear about Sudan, it's a conflict that not many people know much about, is you hear people say people should be talking more about this. The level of suffering seems to be, comparable to what's going on in Gaza. But we talk about Gaza a lot because, I mean, personally, I feel like I understand the conflict. I also understand, what the right thing to do would be. I think if the West put some pressure on Israel to stop bombing Gaza and come to an agreement about a two-state solution, you could have a solution, right? I can see how this works. Whereas when I look at Sudan, I'm not sure what I would be demanding, and I imagine lots of people are the same. So when people say, we should be talking more about Sudan, we need to do something about Sudan, I mean, what can that mean in practice? How should people understand this?
You don't see, as you say, the same simple narrative, which is not to say it's a wrong narrative, about Sudan. I think, on the other hand, just to appreciate the depths of the tragedy and the struggle within the country, right, in which you have literally half the population in need of humanitarian assistance. You have more than 18 million people facing acute food insecurity, right? We're talking about 5 million people slipping into IPC 5, which is the categorization which is famine, right? 5 million people slipping into famine in the coming months. And there are actually people who are around the country organizing themselves to try to address that. And that's the resistance committees. And I think, if you remember, when the war began in April 2023, the humanitarian agencies largely hightailed it out of there, understandably, to some degree. But the people, especially in Khartoum, who picked up the slack, were the groups that had run the protests that had led to the fall of Bashir. And as the war began, there was a lot of debate around whether these groups should be backed by humanitarians, and a lot of pushback from humanitarians that said, oh no, these groups are political. We can't back these groups, which is absurd. Because, of course, at the moment, to get aid through Port Sudan, you need the sign-off of the Sudan Armed Forces, the HAC, the Humanitarian Oversight Committee. How's that not political? Of course that's political. So I think the second thing to say is, there is a very clear narrative here that there are groups throughout this country, civilian groups, organizing to try to create new spaces for dialogue and try to create humanitarian routes for people, and they're being systematically marginalized by Western diplomatic powers who have placed all of their emphasis on using Sudan effectively as a scapegoat to try to restore relationships between the US and Saudi following October 7th of October. Sorry, it's a British audience.
In a civil war, I suppose often for the general population of the public, what you want is either for one side to win quickly or for them to come to some kind of peace agreement, for there to be some peace process. Are either of those two sort of options on the horizon, and how would one hasten one of those options if that were what someone was desiring?
So there aren't two sides to the conflict. That's important to say, right? There's a whole bunch of non-aligned rebel groups. There's the Sudan People's Liberation Army North, which controls liberated territory in South Kordofan and Blue Nile. There's a variety of groups in Darfur resisting both the RSF and the army. So it's not, obviously, that's not giving you a simple answer. That's saying that there's a lot of different groups. I think, what can the West do? For a start, it can make as a de facto red line that the resistance committees and the emergency rooms currently giving out aid and affecting and assisting the people of South Sudan are a necessary and fundamental part of any negotiations. I think at the moment there is, because of course there isn't the West, right? There's a series of different competing actors, each with their own interests, and there's a great deal of forum shopping. I think one of the problems with these sort of negotiations, as ever, is that the demand to do something, anything, often takes the place of actually substantive commitments. And so what you get is basically just PR and empty talk. And since the beginning of the war, we've seen talks all over the place. We've seen them in Addis, we've seen them in Riyadh, we've seen them in Qatar. It doesn't, name the place, there's been talks. But the reality is there hasn't been the ground for those talks. And what those talks have done is reified the position of the military actors, has made the military actors the fundamental organizing principle of Sudan. Whereas the reality was, before this conflict, the military was weak. And what this conflict has done, even though the people of Sudan are losing, is make both sides win because of the consequence of the negotiations, which haven't put the people of Sudan first. Instead, it's marginalized them in face of the military actors. And of course, there has to be a negotiated solution to this, and there will be. Neither side can win this militarily. But the question is in how that solution is arrived at, what those negotiations look like, the details and the specifics, and what the West should be pushed for, if we're allowed to use that absurd abstraction for a moment, is an absolute unconditional civilian handover to the resistance committees and the emergency rooms. Because what we've seen is America look desperately around for any sort of third force, they love third forces, that can possibly take a place and guarantee a civilian transition. But all of those forces have joined up with the RSF. Right? Abdullah Hamdok, the great technocrat, former World Bank employee, is now to be seen promenading around against a man indubitably guilty of committing war crimes.